Hello and welcome to this discussion on your IP, your future with Creative First. Our first speaker today is Tara Deshpande. She is an actress, writer, former model and MTV VJ. She has appeared in several acclaimed films such as Sudhir Mishra's Is Raat Ki Subah Nahi, Kehzad Gustad's Bombay Boys. Tara has also published her first book at the age of 23, 50 and done, and we're going to talk more about it during our discussion today. Before entering the world of movies, she was a model and MTV VJ and a regular on the Mumbai stage. She played Begum Sumru in Alec Padamsee's play of the same name. In addition to 50 and Done, she has authored several other books such as A Sense for Spice, An Indian Sense of Salad, and contributed to the food anthology Chilies and Porridge, which is published by HarperCollins. Tara has also authored an online suspense thriller, The Motive, which gives internet users to make their contributions to this story. This project was promoted by software giant Adobe and was considered India's first e-novel. Tara studied at the Cathedral and John Connon School and then subsequently at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, from where she obtained a major in economics and political science. Tara lives both in Mumbai and Manhattan. So welcome, Tara, to Mumbai and for the holidays here.
Thank you so much. And I wish you a very happy holiday season.
Of course, our second speaker, you would have seen him in many of our conversations, Jamshed Mistry. He's an experienced counsel and founder of the International Legal Alliance. He has a demonstrated history of working in the law practice industry and is skilled in various types of litigation, international law, media and entertainment law. Jamshed is a member of the Bombay Bar Association, the Intellectual Property Rights Practitioners Association, Maximum Lawyer Group, and associate member of the Canadian Bar Association. He is also on the advisory board member of the South Asian Fashion Week in Vancouver and the Vancouver International South Asian Film Festival. Happy holidays to you also, Jamshed, and thank you for joining this conversation with us today.
Thank you. I wish you the same. Thanks.
Tara, what was the transition like from a model to a VJ and then moving into acting?
Well, it's all creative work, it's all performance related work. So the transition, and of course, when you're that young, you don't think about things like transition. But because I had a stage background, I think that helped me a great deal with feeling comfortable in different mediums. So I don't think the transition was difficult. But MTV, when they first came to India, this is around 94, maybe prior to that too, it was MTV Australasia at that time. There was no MTV India. So we were among the first VJs to be hired in India by MTV at that time. And our contracts were with, were all out of New York City in the United States. They worked very differently from the way things worked in India at that period of time. They had extremely elaborate contracts and they had very large foreign crews that came to India. And it was a really wonderful eye-opening experience because I worked with people from all over the world, which, as you can imagine, in 1993 was an unusual experience. And when these entire crews went on road shows through India, at that time there was no, Netflix, no internet on your phone. So it was like the prime attraction for all the youngsters in the area, and it was a very different vibe. So it was great fun. Yeah.
And, over the years, you've become such an accomplished actor and you're also now a writer and an author today. How has the journey been like for you?
Well, again, people often ask, you do so many different things. How do you manage it? I've never thought of it like that because it's really just a creative stream. And when you're an artist, there is no boundary at all, There are lots of painters who are also sculptors. There are lots of actors and comedians who are writers. There are lots of producers and film directors who are great chefs. So it's an extension of your creativity, really. And writing is a natural extension, I think, because really there would be no cinema if there was no writing. So all these are all merged together. And today, because we have so many different mediums in which this creativity is expressed, it has created a whole new set of needs and demands, both in the world of intellectual property as well as in the legal world.
So, how did you have knowledge about image rights in those days? And, I'm very interested in this project that you worked on, The Motive, which was, of course, promoted by Adobe. Tell us more about both these aspects.
I think right on from the beginning, because I had a good lawyer, and I'm going to wink because we all know who that was.
Yes.
He sort of was a pioneer in the field of entertainment law. He understood and predicted things before anyone actually knew they were going to happen. And so understanding, what you had to get paid for, what your rights were, how you should charge, how can an image be used. And at that period of time, there were far fewer things to actually worry about. You didn't feel it at that time because you had no clue that you're going to have YouTube and you're going to have Pinterest and you're going to have Vimeo and the list is endless today. But of course, at that period of time, television outside of Doordarshan had begun, ZTV had started. So that was a very big change for all of us. I was among the first, again, to be hired by ZTV to do a series called Kab Kyun Kahan, which was produced by a very new and very young UTV. Ronnie Screwwala was running the show at that time. So things were very different for us. But of course, we never expected that 20 years later, it's going to explode, into hundreds of other different forms without any parameters, without any boundaries. So I think I learned from a very early age that, images can be used for this, and this is how you have to be reimbursed for it. And this is what can and can't be done. But again, the laws have developed considerably since then. So for instance, at that time too, we knew there was a difference between modeling for a product and endorsing a product. They're two very different things. But I think endorsing a product was much
different for our viewers. What's the difference?
Well, when you model for a product, you're just an actor. You're not endorsing or stating that you personally love this product or use this product, or you're not sort of describing the virtues of this product very positively and encouraging people to buy it. You're just an actor. It's like if I do the role of, say, Mindy in a play, it's just a character I'm playing. It's the same thing. If I'm just an actor in an ad film, that's it. So there is a difference. And endorsing products at that time was much easier than it is now, because now I think they make the people who endorse products a little more responsible for what they're encouraging the public to buy. So again, many a minefield to navigate. So that was one difference. And then you asked me to talk about the motive. Now, that was a very unusual and interesting project. Adobe, the software giant, was coming to India. They were investing what at that time appeared to be a fair bit of money into the Indian economy. And I think it was an exercise in, of course, promoting their software, but also an exercise in protecting their software. And they thought that it would be really good to get involved with this project where we would create an e-novel. And it was described at that time as India's first e-novel. And I would write the first chapter, and then contributors would send in hundreds, in some cases thousands of chapters, and we would select the next best installment. So it was a collaborative process. Again, sets up an entirely new set of what is your property, what is mine, what have I contributed to the story. And in the case of intellectual property, which is in most cases intangible as well as indivisible, it's a very interesting exercise in thought, really. So it was a very interesting project. And what it meant was that for the first time, an author could reach out to the whole of India, because anyone could get online and read this chapter, and anybody could send in an installment, right? And there were lots of people who wrote in who didn't even speak English as a first language, but cobbled together a second chapter. And I thought that was amazing. We're talking about now 2000. So we're talking about nearly 21 years ago, something so innovative was being done. And it sort of involved the youth in a kind of very intellectual way, because, they were basically writing a story that would eventually become a novel. So it was very interesting and great fun.
Jamshed, coming back to rights, can you provide some insight on the rights of models and the kind of contracts you sign in this regard?
Sure. So, modeling contracts also had a very interesting history. I remember when we started out as sort of lawyers, and even probably before that, I mean, the kind of contracts that you would see, the first thing that you would get is a sort of a, what we now call an NDA or an NDC. So they would call it a release form. It was like half a paragraph, and it just said that you would give up your image, all the other rights for a particular amount of money, and then that's it. While the other, as you sort of went on, and you had some very interesting, in those days you had someone like Mayor Jesia's Vimal contract. I mean, that was very interesting. Those contracts had in those days, even clauses for, in case you wanted to renew the contract, you had sort of clauses which said that for an amount which perhaps was a little less than what you received in the first year, it could have been exclusive for maybe a couple of more years. Now, those sort of clauses were quite interesting at that point of time, and I think they should be included even now. But over a period of time, they've been sort of pretty much merged into the type of contract that maybe an actor also would have. And then your various rights, the different type of rights, as Tara said, have sort of multiplied. I mean, initially, yes, a performer's right was there, but it wasn't recognized. Also, essentially, what is you're modeling in the sense your silhouette is who you are. You're never there in person. I mean, it wouldn't be sort of Tara as herself. It would have been Tara as somebody else. And that distinction, between endorsing a product and not, in today's day and age, has become very, very crucial, because if you do, then even the person who is endorsing the product comes within the scope of consumer protection under the new amendment. And therefore, perhaps if you endorse a product without knowing its values or actually testing it out, you could land yourself in a problem or liability. The other interesting aspect was jurisdiction. Quite often you would find companies from abroad insisting that they use say the jurisdiction of California or places like that, which would pretty much make the contract out of bound for a model who's just in India and had probably no means to actually fight it. Now, of course, it's pretty much equal. You could negotiate. Jurisdiction is, of course, decided by where you are or the other party is, but you could have alternate dispute resolution as well. The introduction of mediation and arbitration has now become an integral part of a modeling contract. And yes, should the model really know what they're getting into? I think that's very, very important. And don't sign anything without speaking to your manager or lawyer. That's something very straightforward.
How would you define image rights?
So, again, the term, image rights in the context of the Copyright Act. See, you are projecting yourself as, what is your role? It again depends on exactly what type of role you have. Are you there for a still ad? Are you there for in the context of a model? Are you there, for example, wearing, putting on somebody else's clothes and walking on the ramp, and then you're getting shot for that? Or today you may be also there for a live show, like a VJ or a celebrity or something. So it actually depends upon the type of work, and your image or what you create and what you perform, then that gets merged into and will have to fit into the various rights that the Copyrights Act, at least as far as India is concerned, in that space. So once you are able to sort that out and say that, and of course, if it's a performance, then as a performer you should get your rights. or if you are, doing a multitude of things, like Tara said that she can be an actor at one end, she can be a celebrity chef on the other end, she can be a writer. You could even have a multitude of these things all rolled into a contract as well. So that flexibility is there, and the Indian Contract Act provides for it.
Tara, do you see a difference between acting in TV and movies? And was the transition easy? What are the lessons you learned along your journey?
Well, it's interesting, there was this stereotype, or shall I say, there was this phobia at that time that if you did too much television, then you wouldn't be able to do films. Now we all know that that didn't prove to be correct. We also know that everyone is now moving on to, is basically watching more television than ever before. Of course, no one could have ever predicted the pandemic and the fact that people would be stuck at home watching things on their cell phones and their computers and their televisions. So the transition was very interesting because the film industry, of course, I call it an industry, but it isn't really technically one, was very well established when new television channels came into India. So a lot of the things that were already established in the movie industry, sort of just by virtue of it being a similar medium. I mean, in the end, you were acting, you were performing, right? So they just sort of transcended boundaries and got applied to the television industry. But a lot of the television industry was sort of being run in a very corporate way, which was different from Bollywood at that time in the 90s. So you had much lengthier contracts, you had a sort of slightly different attitude to the way things were done. You also had television shows dependent on corporate sponsoring them. So that set up an entirely different set of trends, and in a sense, I think that when corporates started sponsoring shows on television, it suddenly also became more common to find placements, product placements in movies than was the case before television exploded into multiple channels and cable TV and things like that. So I think from an artist's point of view, the good news was that there was just so much more work because there were so many more channels that I think thanks to television, the industry expanded. It grew. And both power as well as capital, as well as influence started to spread around a lot more. There was I would say, it became a little bit more democratic in some ways than it used to be. And then, of course, when there's something good, something not so good also happens. It became very essential to create a set of legal parameters, because suddenly you had people shooting 52 days straight for daily soaps that were running. Now their needs are very different from someone who goes in and shoots for 10 days straight for a film. Then 2 months later, another 10 days, and then the film is done. It's a very different kind of performance and function. And of course, entertainment law had to keep up with that.
Jamshed, what do TV hosts need to keep in mind while signing contracts, especially when promotion these days is imperative for the success of a show?
So I think, as Tara rightly said, I mean, I think it's what you need to keep in mind is like, the introduction of, for example, the concept of gig workers in the labor code. I mean, I kind of like to give that as a great example, where you have someone on contract, you have somebody who's probably there far more often and doing a lot more work than say for a film, which is just so many days of shoot. Yes, for ads also they do specify the number of days of shoot, but that can be few and far between. But here it is if a show, and it's depending on its popularity, it grows. So you're there. It's almost like a 24/7 job. You're almost like an employee in a sense. So then all those aspects need to be factored in. I mean, even things like, insurance, what happens in sets, or, your compensation, your package, sort of, including, of course, I mean, this is, without the pandemic, a lot of travel, because you are also expected then to, be at the airport at sort of 4 a.m., reach a particular place, do your shoot, come back, then maybe, travel again. So I think all those things need to be sort of factored in. And therefore, I always say that the contract is alive. It's as alive as the person itself, and it must be looked at like that. And so therefore, when you sort of negotiate and a contract for a TV host, you would definitely keep these things in mind more particularly than perhaps you would for a feature film. So I think these are the differences.
So, I mean, so that would also mean that, say, you are a TV host and you probably, because you've done so well, you get more programming with the same channel. So do you negotiate that separately?
Well, I think it all happens together. The negotiation usually happens right at the beginning. So, you say, and depending upon sort of who you are and your status, etc., that would certainly matter I mean, small things like whether a 4-star accommodation or 5-star accommodation. I mean, I think it's quite silly at times, but, it's you have, people negotiating on things like that. Well, in fact, what they really should be focusing on is on things like insurance and things like that, which are far more. I know we usually hope that nothing happens, but if something does happen and then you have to be sort of taken out of the show or replaced by someone, etc., then that aspect should be brought into and anticipated. So that anticipation is very important in a contract. So what can go wrong, or even for example, in case there is a dispute or a difference, instead of rushing to courts, and as we all know, courts are highly overburdened, so you would prefer to go have a process of mediation and arbitration rather than taking the matter to court, except for copyright, where you don't have an option.
Tara, with social media becoming an important part of public image and promotion, how do you manage your image rights to ensure that you're getting adequately compensated for the use of your image?
It's a very, it's a very loose concept still in India.
Right.
You give your images away to people all the time for use. It really depends on what the purpose is, what the function is. Obviously, if you shoot something for a product and you're getting paid for it, then the rights of that image lie with the person who paid for it. Now, with images, the thing is, it's much easier to prove that someone misused your image or used a photograph you took and said it's their photograph, or did not cite you for a contribution. But again, it really depends which medium you're using it in. So for instance, now, if I was to take someone else's image and use it on my Instagram profile and say, I took it, I've done two things that I shouldn't have. One is I've taken it without asking their permission. And two, I've attributed it to myself, right? But on Pinterest, which is a very different form of social media, the whole thing is about collecting images on your board that belong to various people and creating a board saying, oh, I love all these images, I like all these images. Then people see images that you have selected and start following you. But those images are seldom really attributed to anybody. You don't take permission for putting them on your board. But the purpose of that medium is such that it precludes you having to ask for permission to put that on your board. You get what I'm saying? So really, things like copyright, patents, all this has become one big bale puri because it changes from medium to medium, right? Now, for instance, if I'm talking to you just now and I have a beautiful song by Muhammad Rafi playing in the background, right? Could someone tomorrow say you misuse that? You didn't take permission from us for that music to be playing in the background. But if I turn around and say that it was playing on national radio, then am I liable? No, because I was listening to the radio at home. It's a public broadcast, right? So it sets up a whole bunch of really interesting parameters. And it's not always been easy. It's much harder when you're trying to protect the written word. Much, much harder. So I'll give you an example. I wrote an article on a particular food history subject. And a couple of months later, I had written it in English. And a couple of months later, some very young journalist contacted me saying, I have quoted you from that piece in my article. Please do read it and tell me what you think. And he had written it in a regional language, which I happened to be able to read. So, I obliged and I clicked on the link. And what do I find is that basically he's taken my entire article, translated it into his local language, and put one line on top and one line underneath, and passed it off as an article he wrote, right? So now he didn't mean to plagiarize anything. He didn't mean to misuse it, because if he had, would he tell me to go read it? He wouldn't. Nowhere was there any, there was no in quote, there were no quotation marks. There was no little, star or asterisk at the bottom to say taken from so-and-so. But this brings up an entire flurry of copyright, plagiary, violations that I don't think the poor fellow had any clue even exist. So the problem really isn't that people are sometimes doing things deliberately. I think they just don't understand what they're doing. So for instance, it's one thing to quote someone from an article, but you have to do it the right way, right? It's another thing to then take someone's writing and translate it in entirety without their permission. Because, even translating, you have to take permission from someone. So I think in India, where everything has for so long been an oral tradition, things are passed down orally. I think the concept and understanding of how to protect your images, what is copyright, what is intellectual property is very, very weak. So I think that people need to be educated more about it.
How would the same situation be dealt with in America? Because you have a fairly large amount of experience. You also live there. So how does it differ? Maybe 1 or 2 points on that.
Well, I think there's much more awareness of intellectual property, but it doesn't mean that, of course, these issues do not arise. I mean, I'm watching films about how the idea for Facebook was actually conceptualized by somebody else. And, it was then put into practice by someone else. How do you protect an idea or a thought that is indivisible and intangible? But the United States has very strict laws, they have very well thought out laws, and they are very strongly implemented. But I also think that the reason for that is largely because, business is conducted mostly in either 1 or 2 languages. In India, we have, God knows how many different languages, which makes our country very interesting and beautiful. But it sets up a whole new set of parameters. So if someone was to take my article and translate it into a language such as Malayalam, which I do not speak, unless someone in Malayalam was to make the connection, I'm never going to know, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's very difficult to implement this. Of course, we have, one law that applies to all our states in the case of many different laws, but I'm sure state-wise there are laws that are a little bit different. And, Jamshed, who's an expert in all this, can cast a better light upon this than me. But in the US, copyright, patent, etc., laws differ state-wise, so really, and again, there it can set up its own complexities, because the property, the idea could have been thought of in Georgia, and it could have been flouted in Massachusetts, right? So heck, what are you supposed to do?
But as a performer, what is the difference that you have felt? Because, you've obviously looked at both contracts. The contracts that you signed.
Contracts are very complex in the United States. They're very well established in the US. You have bodies that are extremely sort of aggressive, protecting artists as well as protecting producers, or distributors, so on and so forth.
Could you name a few bodies which protect performers' rights?
Well, there are guilds, that protect artists as well as performers, and they play a very important role in ensuring that you have your insurance. They play a very important role in deciding how many hours you work, what you do, and they play a very important role in making sure you get your royalties, your compensation. You also, I'll give you an example. We were actually invited to New York for a screening of Bombay Boys. And what the organizer forgot to do was to take permission from the local body in New York for the use of a screening projector. By law in New York, it has to be operated by someone who is a member of the Artists Guild. You can't just hire anybody, So we couldn't use a projector because it was too late. It had to be screened on a video, So there's a lot of, there's a lot of this stuff. Sometimes I think it's an impediment. Sometimes I think it's really useful. Again, it depends which side you're sitting on, right? I mean, for us, it felt like an impediment because our film wasn't screened properly. But for the people who work for a living running projectors, it's only fair that they be called. So वहाँ पे बहुत बारीकी है, मतलब बहुत nuance है, and it's a lot of this is established, but it doesn't mean rules aren't flouted. It doesn't mean that there aren't issues. Of course there are. Eventually, when you have to get a screenplay or a story translated and make it into a film, you have to understand that there is a certain amount of reasonableness and practicality that is required. You have to understand that there is one person taking a greater risk because their money is on the line, and you have to be flexible. So you can say one thing, but it's like landlord-tenant law. You can say a lot of stuff on paper, but zindagi mein kya hota hai aur kaisa hota hai pata nahi hai na. We don't know how it's going to work out. So I think a lot of it comes down to experience and making choices.
Jamshed, do you think India needs to incorporate any aspects of US law in our IP regime? I mean, Tara's thrown light on a lot of practical aspects. What's your view on this?
I mean, for example, I think the copyright law is definitely moving in the right direction. I mean, we're having amendments done from time to time. We've taken, that's a great thing. We are allowed to sort of take the best from the West, right? I mean, whether it's sort of moving from the US regime to the French regime. For example, moral rights were never really a part of our law, but now they are. So it's interesting how that is happening. But I think the important aspect is these bodies, who are there to sort of protect. For example, the Writers Guild of in the US, or SAG and ACTRA, they all have they've been approved constitutionally. While here they are like societies or trusts or sometimes even limited companies, but they don't have the that kind of constitutional backing. And it was very in a particular case. For example, in court, we had asked. I mean, there was a dispute with regard to a screenwriter said that his sort of script was utilized and wrongly utilized. But what happened was the court said that at the highest, the Screenwriters Association only has the power to maybe compare the two scripts, and that's it. But while if you actually went to the Writers Guild of America, if they say pen down and things like that, there is a very healthy respect for the law, and therefore it gets implemented, and therefore the bargaining power is perhaps something that they need to sort of understand, at least as far as India is concerned. And then of course the systems of royalty and timing and payment, and the example that she gave, that if you don't have the right person at the right time, and unionized and non-unionized, that is also something that has to come in, because see, at the end of the day, this isn't, I mean, as much as we would like to say that it's very Indian and things like that. No, you are a part of a global scenario, and therefore, these aspects must be brought in. They can be curated, but they have to, because entertainment and media law is probably one of the most uniform laws across the world. You can't have a better example than this.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, Jamshed, that if our entertainment industry is now global, then adopting global laws and streamlining the process makes us actually even more competent, capable, and efficient. I think that's a really, really good point you brought up. Yeah.
With that, and that's a great insight. Thank you so much, Tara and
My
Jamshed,
pleasure.
for sharing such amazing insights. I'm sure our audiences will appreciate and understand. Thank you so much.